Hello and welcome to Press TV News Analysis. I'm Kavita Aghwai. The slogan, "This is what democracy looks like," has been advocated by the Occupy protest movements that have swept across the United States. Well, in this news analysis, we will dissect this slogan and why U.S. officials, such as the President and the Secretary of State, as examples, have exercised double standards on this issue. Also, we will look at a new report saying the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have actually been working with mayors of 18 cities on how to shut down the protest movement.
U.S. police in riot gear have sharply intensified crackdown on Occupy Wall Street protest, using batons, tasers and pepper sprays to disperse peaceful protesters. On Tuesday, New York police hauled away, under the cover of the night, demonstrators on Zuccotti Park. At least 200 people were arrested. This after a judge sided with the city officials, ruling that peaceful protesters are not allowed to set up their camp at the park. It seems that Tuesday's raid has been a part of coordinated pressures on the movement by police. A day earlier, police officers forcibly removed the tens of Occupy Oakland protesters from an encampment at the Frank Ogawa Plaza. They also detained several protesters there. The demonstrators have vowed to stay together indefinitely, protesting against corporate greed, economic, social and political injustices, either in Zuccotti or elsewhere. Many protesters believe that intensified police efforts will strengthen the movement, which has now expanded to much of the United States since it began in September.
Well, we'll find a new place. I mean, absolutely. This is going to move out into local communities. I think that there needs to be kind of central places for the movement, but I also think that it's going to move into neighborhoods all over the country and all over the world.
U.S. authorities have remained noticeably silent on the police brutality in a country that calls itself a defender of democracy and freedom of speech. Moreover, the Obama administration has so far failed to address the demands of the Occupy Wall Street movement. This is in sharp contrast with repeated U.S. calls on the governments in the Middle East and North Africa during the Arab uprising, urging them to heed their nation's demands and respect their rights to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression, something that American protesters have been denied.
It is the responsibility of the government of Libya to respect the universal rights of their own people, including their right to free expression and assembly.
Instead of respecting the rights of his own people, Gaddafi chose the path of brutal suppression. A campaign of intimidation and repression began.
Let's find out what this means to our guests. Co-author of Crashing the Tea Party, Paul Street, joins us from Madison. We have from Occupy Boston, Acacia Brewer, who joins us from Boston. And director of The World Can't Wait, Deborah Sweet, joins us from New York. I'd like to welcome all my guests. Deborah Sweet, first to you. How do you read the statements by the U.S. president when he encourages demonstrations, the right to assemble and freedom of expression in some countries, while back at home people were dragged by their legs and their hair, they were thrown into police van with tear gas and sound bombs, which resulted in mass arrests occurring at what I'm referred to as Zuccotti Park?
Well, I think President Obama and Secretary Clinton put themselves in the same camp with repressive governments all over the world, including Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, all these places where people are protesting in the streets. We're dealing with the same situation, that a certain level of protest is sometimes allowed, a certain type of speech, but clearly the Occupy protests in the United States have been targeted for their message, not for health and safety violations, not because the populations that we're appealing to were not supportive, but clearly because the authorities and the police in particular were mobilized to suppress the message of Occupy Wall Street and at least 10 other occupations around the country in the last few days.
Well, Acacia Brewer, let me come to you. After what happened in Oakland and New York, no U.S. officials came out to condemn the police violence. No U.S. government official has criticized the violence that Iraq war veterans Scott Olson and Kayvon Sabari were exposed to. How do you explain that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I just couldn't hear you.
I'm talking about after what happened in Oakland and in New York in terms of the, any reactions that didn't come from U.S. officials, I should say, and that's in the two cases when we talk about Scott Olson, the Iraq war veteran, served time in Iraq in terms of active duty there twice, and we have another one, Kayvon Sabari. I mean, they weren't sympathetic to what occurred to them. How do you explain that stance?
Right. I think that in this movement, and it's not new to political movements or civil movements, there are going to be contradictions everywhere. We're seeing that in a state basis. We're seeing it within the country, and that's also something that is global that we're experiencing. It's very new to me to have all these different opinions and contradictions being told to me as an occupier. I think it's absolutely horrific what happened to Scott Olson, and it's also bad when it happens to someone who isn't a veteran, I don't think that people should be treated in this way.
Yeah, but when we talk about contradictions, I mean, is that a word that you're using that kind of puts doesn't give it that much weight behind what is going on? Because when you look at the overall stance of all the different things that the Occupy protest movement stands for, you would think that the war veteran would be something that U.S. officials should somehow be sympathetic to what occurred. I mean, this is a war veteran, not to mention the 35-year-old who shot himself, which many media were saying, putting a propaganda spin on it that, oh, there's violence behind these protest movements. But that was a war veteran that also commits suicide, not to mention the number of suicides that takes place by war veterans. It doesn't make sense for U.S. officials not to come out and at least make mention of what has occurred.
I agree that it's extra bad when it happens to someone who has put their life on the line. I know that, within Occupy Boston, when we were raided a couple weeks ago, the Veterans for Peace were the first that were pushed down and attacked. These are people that, were in their 70s, and they were trying to protect us, and they were even treated in this way. It's pretty disgusting to me.
Well, Paul Street, I'm going to come to you. A professor at the University of Michigan, Juan Cole, maybe you've read this, has written an article in which you said the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the mayors of 18 counties have been strategizing how to shut down OWS protests, in which he said municipal authorities appear to have been conspiring to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly and freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances. How do you explain that? Do you agree with him?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. These repressions launched across 18 different cities are clearly coordinated. And there's no way that the mayors, most of whom are Democrats, have not interacted with the political establishment in Washington, the administration, about this strategy. It's clear that the decision has come down, both locally and from the top down, to put the kibosh on these campsites. They are deemed to be too dangerous and too much of a threat to existing power relationships in this country right now. I want to add one further thing, and that is simply there's nothing new about this sort of hypocrisy. This goes back a long way in U.S. politics and policy. Democracy is fine. People's power is desirable in other countries, particularly in officially designated enemy regimes. All through the Cold War, we were constantly hearing about the need for democracy in the Soviet bloc. And at the same time, the FBI was involved in infiltrating and oppressing movements for social justice at home and against the Vietnam War. That continued up through the struggles in solidarity with the people of El Salvador that took place in this country, Central America. There's a long history of that. It's one thing to oppose authoritarianism and tyranny in the Soviet bloc or in Saudi Arabia or in the Middle East, but when people start challenging the unelected dictatorship of money, the 1% that controls more than a third of the wealth and half of the elected officials in this country, it's all of a sudden it becomes problematic. And false pretexts such as threats to public safety and sanitary issues and so forth have to be concocted to justify the clearance of people from public spaces. What few public spaces are really left for democracy in this country.
Exactly, and when you talk about the reason that the New York mayor actually cited, which was for sanitary reasons, I mean, this is something that perhaps they want to highlight, but they're not highlighting, for example, the culture of police violence. Deborah Sweet, for example, in Oakland, where police, the department there has been non-compliant with police standards. And this has been cited, having a history of planting evidence even, framing arrested individuals, and being trigger-happy. New York police, not much better in their report card. And in terms of fairness of the U.S. judicial system, we saw what happened with that restraining order the New York mayor came out with. I mean, what does that say overall, even in terms of human rights and, of course, the legal and judicial system in the U.S.?
Well, of course, the plaza where Occupy Oakland has been for a month or so has been renamed Oscar Grant Plaza, which, of course, is the young man who was killed 3 years ago by the Oakland police. And you're absolutely right, and so is Paul. Thank you for talking about the history of the U.S. hypocrisy going back decades. It's absolutely the case that any other government is always guilty, but this government's hands are always clean when they're talking about themselves. But in terms of policing in the United States, you have a militarization of all major urban police departments now. It really doesn't matter to us whether a particular policeman agrees with a policy or not. These are institutional decisions made above the level of police departments, above the level of Ray Kelly, above the level of mayors probably, in terms of the need for the powers that be in this country to suppress these protests. They have no idea what to do with people who just say, look, we don't care that you are the rulers of the world, that you're multi-billionaires, that you have all these palaces on Wall Street. We want a different world. We human beings don't want to live this way anymore. And we are not afraid of your nightsticks. We're not afraid of your jails. I really think they, number one, have no idea what to do about these protests in acting the same old ways. They've surveilled us from every single angle. They have many, many people's names. They even had them when they went to the park yesterday morning. They knew who they were arresting. This surveillance has not stopped the Occupies. It's only grown them. And this is a big problem for the powers that be.
Well, again, we're putting focus here through, of course, what I'm asking, but in terms of police tactics and protocols, I mean, still the images of people being dragged by the hair and legs and being shoved into police vans in Zuccotti Park really shed a light on this. And in terms of that, it really puts into focus, Acacia, doesn't it, about the way police have handled this, and then about the First Amendment in the United States. Why isn't the right of these peaceful protesters being valued, been respected? I mean, you as from Occupy Boston there, how do you feel that this is the way that police are exercising on what is your right, which is the Constitution and the First Amendment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first time we were raided, where we saw our first sort of look of brutality was when we expanded. We were still peaceful. We just moved across the street so that we could house more of the people who were joining us. They told us that we were going to be arrested. That's something that the mayor has told us would only happen if we were not peaceful, and we were. We set up camp and everything was going fine, and they still arrested us, and they still used brutality. And 141 people were arrested. We were able to bail them all out, but it was just amazing to see people coming back with cuts and bruises, and crying. When we did stay, truthfully, a nonviolent protest, I agree with what the other two have said, that it's new to them. They don't really understand how to deal with it. I don't think they're dealing with it in the way that they should. People should not be getting shot. We shouldn't have riot police coming after peaceful people who have no intention of fighting back. Myself, I will not fight back. I don't think you should reciprocate violence with violence. that doesn't solve anything to me. And I agree that it's just disgusting the way that most of these occupations have been taken down.
And in terms of where you are in Boston, I believe there's about 300 to 500,000 students. Boston is known to be a college town. And, of course, given the longevity of these protest movements, we have to wait and see how the police are going to act on the protests happening there. Let me come to you, Paul Street. This is another aspect which went down at Zuccotti Park, in which journalists and photographers from some major news corporations were also arrested. I mean, how did that come about, the decision? I mean, was this a billionaire mayor's decision, or does it really reflect actually how U.S. officials want the future Occupy protest movements to be dealt with on a wider scale?
Well, I think it pretty accurately reflects how they do want them to be dealt with. You know, there was this, there's been this ambiguity. There's then been this kind of balancing act that the Democratic Party and the Obama administration have been playing with regard to Occupy. On one hand, they're hoping that this populist upsurge, this grassroots movement against the few, might be able to be channeled to and co-opted by and turned to their electoral advantage in the 2012 elections. I don't think their efforts in that regard have been particularly successful. This movement seems to be different than the Tea Party, which clearly was an adjunct of the GOP and of billionaires, and sort of consistently bipartisan and nonpartisan and not co-optable or usable in those kinds of ways. And it seems like the decision has come down. Occupy Wall Street actually started getting some halfway decent mainstream media coverage, even from such outlets as the corporate New York Times. It had nice things said about it by New York Times columnist Paul Krugman and even by the New York Times editors. And I think the message is coming down to mainstream journalists. This is not a movement to coddle. This is not something to be friendly to. This is something to be taken off the front page. It's become a lightning rod for widespread majority progressive populist sentiment in this country, which is very opposed to the excessive wealth and power of the very wealthy few, what the movement calls the 1%, which is actually bigger than the 1%. I'm concerned about the 10%. But you get the point, and I think there is a message being sent out.
Right, and Paul Street, I forgot to mention that one of the employees of Wall Street, of the protesters, well, the ones that were present at the scene, was actually a Bloomberg employee. I forgot to mention that. I wonder how the mayor Bloomberg reacts to that one. Deborah Sweet, though, let's look at the front page. We look at the front page coverage that this is not getting, perhaps, and this is something I don't know if it's getting front page coverage. Senator Tom Coburn highlighting that millionaires in the U.S. have received $30 billion in taxpayer money in write-offs, in which some of them has been paid for gambling losses, vacation homes, babysitting. As I mentioned, I don't know if it's making headlines there in the U.S. Why would this happen? Are you aware of it? Is there a loophole in these tax write-offs? And how can it be stopped?
You know, pardon me for laughing, but that's just every day. That is completely the way Washington and this whole system works. I would even disagree with Paul in saying that half of the politicians in Washington are bought off by Wall Street. You know, you don't get into position to have any authority in this country if you're not beholden to Wall Street and the whole system, and if you're not buying into its wars for empire, its globalization, and the whole thing. It's all part and parcel of a system that exploits and oppresses the rest of the world. And if we step back and look at the 99% and keep the whole world in our hearts, as a lot of people who are occupying right now, we realize that we have a tremendous basis to ally with people around the rest of the world against this system. And again, that's what they're concerned about. Tom Coburn is a stone reactionary Republican. Whatever he's exposing is solely for his own political gain or that of his party. He can't tell us anything that we don't really know about. It is making front page news this morning. We have 4 or 5 pages in the New York Times today about what the Bloomberg administration did yesterday around the country. And we also have a large article about Occupy Cal at UC Berkeley, where there were many thousands of people out last night. I have been on that campus for years. It has been very apolitical for the last few years, and it is stunning and amazingly wonderful to see all of Sproul Plaza filled with students camping out in opposition to the arrest last week of their fellow students. Something is changing. And however the authorities choose to deal with it, and I agree they should be condemned for their repression and brutality, people are starting to find their voice here, and it's just wonderful.
Well, one thing that's happened, and Acacia Brewer, I'd like to come to you, is what recommendations would you make to the U.S. President, Acacia Brewer, on how to deal with the Occupy protest movements across the United States? Especially, there was an incident in Washington in which the White House windows was actually shut by a gunman. I mean, if we're going to get the White House, in a matter of speaking, for the cage to be rattled there, what kind of recommendations would you make to the U.S. President?
You know, I think that this movement, this type of movement, and this type of attitude has to happen. It's happening right now, and I think that that's key. I think that 5 years from now, if we still have this kind of attitude, even if we're not camping out, that's going to be great. And, you know, we found a way to possibly change our country and possibly the world, and it's pretty disturbing that we're not being allowed to do that. I think that we need to, you know, if we want to camp out, we should be able to camp out. If we want to do another type of, you know, occupation, we should be able to do that. If we have to live in this country, you know, I don't think people are going to be happy anymore, which is going about the everyday thing and being cheated, and, you know, it's just too unfair right now. And I agree that what we've done with this global dialogue has totally opened up people's eyes. So even when after the occupations go away, people are still going to be aware. And I think that the president should understand that this is not going away, and it has to happen.
You got to show it at the ballot boxes in 2012, I assume. Okay, we're going to have to end it there, unfortunately. We appreciate that. Acacia Brewer from Boston, from Occupy Boston, co-author of Crashing the Tea Party, Paul Street, thank you. And we had The World Can't Wait, the director, Deborah Sweet from New York, with her statements. And you, the viewer, thank you for watching. Send us any questions, comments, suggestions, newsroom@presstv.ir. From me, Kaveh Tarvay, and the entire team, it's goodbye.